let's talk about BizOps. Because on the surface, BizOps seems like a dream job. You get to solve important problems, you get a seat at the table where big decisions are made, and you get to shape the future of where the business goes. But on the inside, it's a little bit messier than that. One day, you're advising executives, and the next day, you're up at 10 p.m. on a Friday night. I worked in BizOps and consulting over the past 5 years, and what I learned is this: BizOps looks a lot different in reality than on paper. So before you decide you want to work in BizOps, let's talk about what you're actually signing yourself up for.
Yo, Cart, this isn't in the script, man. You're gonna scare them all away. You liked the job too, didn't you? You're right. All right, let's run that back. Take 2.
Because the truth is, BizOps can be a really great career, but only if you have clear expectations for what the work is actually like. Because if the job in reality doesn't match the story that you were sold, then the day-to-day grind can wear you down and leave you feeling burnt out. So that's why in today's video, I'm gonna break down what BizOps really is, what the work is actually like, and ultimately whether or not it's a good fit for you. Because the last thing you want is to say yes to a job that you didn't actually sign up for. All right, so let's actually get into it. What is BizOps? It's the strategy job that everybody wants, but does anybody actually know what it is? So the energy that I'm imagining is if we were grabbing a coffee, if you had like reached out on LinkedIn or something, or you're like a friend of a friend, and you're asking me what this job is actually like, this is what I'd tell you. I've had dozens of these conversations over the years and always found myself wondering, is there a way to make that information more accessible? Because as someone who grew up like working class, who never had parents or friends who worked in these kinds of jobs, it was always just through like the kindness of strangers and alumni that I even found out about these positions. And so if you're in that position, you don't know what this kind of job is, or you're kind of have a little bit of an idea of it, but aren't too sure, this is the conversation that we'd be having. I honestly thought about making this into a PowerPoint for a second, but I didn't want to make a PowerPoint. So instead we have this Notion doc. And this Notion doc, we're going to cover 5 things. The first thing is the pitch. Like, what does the job look like on paper? Why do people, get attracted to it? And then we're going to dive into the reality. So these are the things that no one tells you about what the job actually looks like. And, they're not all bad necessarily, but they're just things that you don't get to see until you're actually on the inside. From there, we're going to talk about what you actually do on maybe a day-to-day basis or on a project basis, and I'll talk about a real example of something that I worked on in the past. Then we're going to get into what is probably the million-dollar question, which is BizOps the right fit for you? Is it a good job or a career for you? And then finally, I'll leave you with a couple of reflective questions and maybe things to think about or ask yourself if you're considering this as a job. Okay, let's get into it. So what does the job actually look like on paper, and why do people get interested in it? So we talked a little bit about this in the introduction, but just at a high level, this job is really appealing to people because you solve really important business problems. You get a front row seat to what the business looks like and how decisions are made, both at an executive senior level, but also in between, like all the layers of like middle management. And you get to see kind of this direction of like, oh, this is how decisions get made and how it flows through. But you also get to see the other end of it of, oh, this is the data, the gathering that's happening, and this is how it influences decisions up at this level. So you really get to understand how a business works. In my case, I worked at a tech company, so I really got to understand how that tech company worked specifically on the sales side, and then how that relates to basically how they bring in revenue. Because you're solving important problems, you're also getting a lot of executive exposure at a pretty early stage of your career. So oftentimes you're sitting in these meetings with like senior directors and VPs, and sometimes even C-suite people, and you're usually the youngest person in the room. And it's kind of crazy. You're this like young 20-something who's just a couple years out of college, maybe in your first or second job, and people are actually looking to you for advice. That not only has high visibility, it also has a huge feeling of validation. In addition to working with executives, you're also working with a lot of different parts of the business. So you might hear the term cross-functionally a lot. Basically, that's just a fancy word for working across different functions. A function might be sales, it might be finance, it might be marketing or a product. And in BizOps, you kind of are this glue person that works across a lot of different parts of the business. You might not work very deeply with any one of those functions. Sometimes you might, depending on the project, but you get a lot of different exposure. So if you're using BizOps as a launch pad, this is a great way to build relationships and to also understand like what different functions do. You oftentimes do see people who are probably a little bit more senior in their BizOps career jumping into other things that are completely unrelated, but because people trust them to be this kind of go-to problem solver, they can make that jump without a problem. One thing that you also do in BizOps and what makes it a really great sell, especially for people young in their career, is that you get to learn a lot. And that's both on the hard skills side, where you learn how to build decks, do modeling, run data analyses, and project management, but also on the soft skills side, where you actually just learn a lot by watching the people around you, seeing how they interact, seeing how someone runs a meeting. And there are so many different styles of doing that. And because of BizOps, you get so much exposure. You can see kind of what works, what doesn't work, and kind of create your own style, especially around communication and building relationships, that kind of like fuzzy stuff that there's no one size fits all model for. And then finally, the pay is pretty good. Like you're not gonna make as much as like a data scientist or a software engineer. Like that's technical side. But if you compare it to consulting, like you're making comparable pay to consulting, but without all the crazy hours. You're not flying around to client sites, you're doing similar work. And so I think relative to consultants, which I think a lot of people who are watching this video probably are or are thinking about, work-life balance is pretty good, pay is pretty good, and it's a great exit to make if you still like that kind of work. All right, so that's the pitch. After hearing that for about 5 minutes, maybe you're like, damn, I need to go sign up for this job. Before you do that, let me tell you about the reality and what no one tells you about the job. The first thing is that strategy and execution work is super messy. Like it sounds sexy on the surface. You gotta like solve important problems, work on these important issues, but there's a lot of ambiguity. And a lot of times that ambiguity comes from no one knowing really what the hell is going on. Like there is no definition of success. The core problem sometimes isn't even super clear, and priorities are kind of changing all the time. Like something that's, important one day as a strategy might change the next day entirely. And a big part of why strategy and execution and operations work is so messy is because it's highly political. Like when you hear the word cross-functional and you think about different teams, you should also think about the word politics. It feels oftentimes like a high-stakes group project where there's no shared rubric. No one has the same agenda. People have different incentives. So if you're the one in the middle who's trying to navigate all of that, again, think you're getting exposure to all these different parts of the business. But all these different parts of the business aren't necessarily working together smoothly. They might have different directions and oftentimes do have different directions that they're pushing towards. So imagine trying to navigate all of that, bring people together, and kind of like, the term you'll hear is drive alignment. That can be very draining. That is also a very useful skill to have, but it's super messy. Related to that, executive exposure isn't necessarily glamorous as well. Like, yeah, you can sit in on meetings with senior directors and VPs, but it's really high pressure. Like the closer you are to the top, the more urgent that things feel, and the more that you get exposed to, last minute changes, fire drills, people changing their mind all the time. And this is very concrete things like, hey, we have this big meeting tomorrow, but I changed my mind about what vision we're going for, so the entire deck needs to be reworked in some big way. Like those are real changes, and the closer you get to the top, the more exposed you get to that. It's not glamorous. And then finally, even though you work on important problems, I mentioned this a little bit, what's important changes constantly. And sometimes it feels like you're not working on something that's important, you're working on something that's urgent, because you don't necessarily get to define what's important. That sometimes is set and oftentimes is set top down. So if someone changes their mind up top, like you are responsible for making sure that that goes through. And so if you're in this fast-paced environment where things are constantly changing and the strategy is constantly changing, that means that you're oftentimes reacting more than you're actually building something. So you don't necessarily have time to be proactive and think deeply about problems. You're just trying to catch up to what's been changed. I think this will probably make a lot more sense when we talk about whether or not BizOps is the right fit for you, or I'm going to dive into a bit more detail about that. But for now, let's kind of take a step back and look at what you actually do. Like, what does the work look like? What does your day look like? Or what does a project look like? And then I'll get into a real example. So what do you actually do? BizOps is a pretty broad term, and to try to give it a single definition is probably going to be pretty hard, because the exact function and what you do on a day-to-day basis is going to vary depending on the company that you're at and the size of the company. So if you're working at a really large tech organization, it's probably going to be a little bit of a different role than if you're a really small startup. And the general rule of thumb I've heard is the smaller the organization, the less that the title matters. So if you're BizOps at a 12-person organization, you're probably doing a little bit of everything. But if you're BizOps at a large corporation like I was that had like thousands and thousands of people, your job is a little bit more specific, and you're probably usually working within a specific vertical. So for me, I worked in go-to-market and sales strategy, but there are also different types of BizOps roles for product strategy. You're a bit closer to finance, you could be a bit closer to marketing. It really depends. But if you cut through all of that, in general, what BizOps is you are the Swiss Army knife person who gets shit done. And whatever that is that you're doing, it's about executing and just making sure that you get to a decision point or a point where someone can do action. It could be strategy today. You could be building like a fancy deck and presenting that to executives. You could be a spreadsheet monkey tomorrow where you're just doing data analysis and running models left and right. Your weeks can vary depending on the project that you're working on. It's really messy, but the through line that connects all this together is pretty simple. You're the person that people go to when things are messy and unclear and a decision needs to be made, and people want to feel good about that decision. At its core, if you really try to distill it down, you're answering one of three types of questions. The first question is, what's wrong and how do we fix it? This could be something like, hey, our revenue for product A is going down over the past quarter or the past year. How do we get it back on track? And so sometimes these are called like get well plans or like action plans. It's like, what can we do to steer this back in the right direction? The second question is the reverse of that. You look at what's working and how you scale it. So you're really looking at the opportunity areas, things that you should do more of, double down on, take bets in. And as you look about strategy, it's like, all right, we should invest more resources into this area. And then finally, and this third question kind of overlaps with the first two, it's what's the best path forward? So if we've decided that we want to do something, so for example, if we take question 2 and think, oh, this product is selling really, really well, this team is doing really, really well. How do we scale it? What's the best path forward is the concrete steps that you would take and prescribe in order to actually scale that business. This question is really, how do we get there? Like, what should we actually do and what are the trade-offs? Because oftentimes when you're making these big strategic decisions, it's not really clear that like one option is necessarily better than the other. There are a lot of both quantitative and qualitative factors that people take into mind. Like, where's the market going? What are competitors doing? What is our product specialty? All that kind of stuff. So how do we actually do these things? Well, you do it in a couple of different ways, but there's one general workflow that kind of permeates all of these questions. The first is that you learn how to diagnose problems and size opportunities. So you look at data, you run analyses, you talk to people to figure out what's broken, why it's broken, where the opportunities are, and what the trade-offs look like. So these are your classic like invest, divest questions. How do you optimize strategy around a particular area? How do you make something work better? That's the question at the end of the day. Step 1 is all about figuring out what the problems and the opportunities are. Step 2 is trying to create some structure around it. A lot of times these questions are pretty messy, and if you're an executive that doesn't have a lot of time, then you want someone who's going to help you sort through that messiness and make it something that's clear and easy to understand. This is why consultants, strategy people, and BizOps people are really good at building frameworks, because you turn something that's like kind of chaotic and ambiguous into a really structured problem with clear action paths forward. So it could be taking something that's like here and then saying, hey, these are the 3 problems that we're actually going to focus on. And for each of these 3 problems, we have 2 strategies that we're going to talk about. This is the final strategy that we're recommending because of XYZ reason. These are the trade-offs. It's like super clear and easy to understand, right? After you do that, you define the problem, you've made it clear and into a framework. You also kind of take messy input from different teams and you're translating across all the different functions, because marketing, sales, ops, finance, they might all be looking at slightly different data and just have a different perspective. Oftentimes in BizOps, you're the person in the middle who's bringing that all together and turning it into something that leadership can actually make a decision on, because they don't want to hear 5 different stories. They want to hear one story that distills it all together so that they can make a decision that they feel good about. That leads us directly into the next step, which is after you've done all that, you've taken all the input, you've run the data, you are providing a strategic recommendation for what to do next. You're packaging all of your insights into recommendations. 99% of the time, that usually takes the form of a PowerPoint deck. And then you're laying out what has happened, what's the fact pattern, how did we get here, and what should we do next? Like, what is the conclusion, and should we do something different? You don't know necessarily if they're gonna take your action plan or not. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But if they do, sometimes you're responsible also for driving the follow through. So this is where like the project management becomes really important, because you're coordinating across different teams, you're tracking progress, and trying to really push the project forward and hold people accountable. So if on week 1 of the action plan, XYZ team says that they're gonna do this thing, on week 2, week 3, you're gonna wanna check back in with that team and see how things are going. This is part of the work that I personally don't find very enjoyable, because you are dealing with a lot of egos, personalities. How do you like push this forward, make sure things are happening? Really, really important. Like, this drives a lot of execution, but this can also be something that's really draining, and I'll talk a bit more about that in detail. Okay, I've been talking for a while. Drink a coffee first. Matcha chat. All right, so that's the big picture of what a project might look like. I'm gonna talk about a specific project that I worked on every single year for the 3 years that I was there that maybe makes this a little bit more real. So every year I did financial target modeling during the annual planning process. And if you haven't heard of the annual planning process before, basically it's this process that companies go through every year. It's the main time of year where leadership sets the strategy and figures out 3 big questions. One is what they wanna go after. What do they wanna invest money in, time in, and kind of set as their North Star for their strategy. The second is the reverse of that. Like, what do they want to walk away from? What are things that are not worth the investment anymore and that we should pull back from? And then finally, at the end of the day, it's like, how do you hit your numbers? If you have a certain sales target, financial target that you're going after, how do you actually game plan to hit those things? So basically, it's like, what do you double down on? What do you walk away from, right? I think I just repeated myself. That was an unnecessary bullet point. Anyway, The stakes are real because you're not just moving budgets around, you're literally deciding where people, money, and time will actually go. And this is the time of year where big reorgs can happen, big restructuring can happen, product decisions are made, like a lot of really, really big decisions are made during this like 4 to 6 month period. And if you get it wrong, you miss your goals, you lose trust, and it's a shit show. You spend the next 12 months cleaning up the mess that you've made during planning. So it's really, really important that you get it right. What was my role in this? Every year, one piece of the planning process that I did was to build the financial targets and figure out how much we were aiming to grow across different teams and different products. This is literally like we get a number top down of like, hey, the company needs to grow 30%, right? This is how the 30% is going to get split across the different teams and the different products. I was the one that built the model that kind of rolled everything up together. So think like giant, massive spreadsheet, multiple tabs with like thousands of lines for each team, each region, each product, and all the different revenue targets that we should be hitting. It's like all those little pieces that added back up to the big number that we were going for. The hard part wasn't necessarily the modeling and plugging in numbers. It means that you're talking to a lot of people. Because when you're talking about something as big as financial targets, everyone has a lot of different opinions. Product has an opinion, marketing has an opinion, sales ops has an opinion, sales has an opinion. If you're the one who's running that model, you need to take all that information in. So a typical day could be, I could wake up on a Monday, 9 a.m., jump on a call with finance to check if their assumptions match our assumptions, if our numbers are kind of the same, if we're projecting similar growth at least. After that, hop on 10 a.m. back-to-backs with different sales ops directors to pressure test the targets. Like, do they think this is reasonable? How do they think their quarter is going so far? The year is going? Are these targets too aggressive? Are they not aggressive enough? And then at 11 a.m., you can meet with the product go-to-market and then do the same thing. Do our numbers match your numbers? How are they different? Let me get your perspective. By noon, I might have rebuilt the model 5 times already and talked to 5 different people just to get it ready for my senior director to review it before he then takes that model and goes and review it with other leadership people. And that's not just one day. That's like weeks of work where you're taking an input, you're working the data, and you're trying to build a recommendation for someone so that they can make a decision off of it. And things were changing all the freaking time. Like if you're thinking about the sales business, revenue forecasts are changing all the time, the market is changing all the time, the products that you're launching might be changing. So the model has to keep up with that in real time, because at any given moment, if someone wanted to make a decision or change the strategy, they wanted a source of truth that they can look to and say like, hey, this is where we're at right now, this is the current state, what do we do about it? Because if the numbers are wrong, the strategic decisions that they're making based on that will be wrong too. I'm gonna pause there for a second and just try to distill like what this captures, right? It's like if we start at the very top, you've diagnosed a very specific problem. In this case, the problem is kind of given to you. This is just something that we do every year. Then you go about collecting data, collecting information, talking to various people, navigating like the politics, and trying to come up with a version of something that makes sense. Like there's never gonna be a perfect answer with something like this. A lot of it is judgment calls and trade-offs, but something that seems reasonable that your boss or your boss's 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 boss or whoever can defend when they're in those big C-suite level type meetings. We have a bit of the good and we have a bit of the bad that we talked about earlier. Good, a lot of executive exposure, a lot of learning, hard skills, soft skills, and you're working on something that's very important. On the flip side of that, a lot of high stakes, a lot of high pressure, last minute fire drills and changes, politics, navigating all that stuff. So if we boil all of that down, we want to be asking the question, is BizOps the right fit for you? We're going to do it in 2 sections. BizOps might be a really great fit for you if these things resonate. And BizOps might not be a great fit for you, and it may be something that you should think about avoiding if you're this kind of person. If when someone has a problem, you like being the person that they go to give advice, to solve it, to kind of be the solution guy, this could be a really good job for you. I remember like 5 months into the role, I was already sitting in meetings with like VPs and directors, and I could be like crunching numbers in a spreadsheet in the morning. And then in the afternoon, I'm like in these big meetings where people are turning to me to influence or give them advice on what they should do next. And I'd catch myself thinking like, holy shit, like I'm 25 years old, they're actually listening to my recommendations. If you like that validation and that's something that excites you, BizOps could be a pretty good role. Something else that BizOps has a lot of, if we think about all the exposure, is variety. If you like working and doing different types of things, from like modeling, building decks, kind of jumping around and talking to different people, this might be a good fit for you. Like it can be pretty chaotic at times because you're moving really quickly, but if that's the kind of stimulation that you like and you don't like just doing one problem or one project for weeks or months at a time, then BizOps might provide the kind of variety that keeps you excited. BizOps is really good for people who are also really curious and you like asking why a lot. And the reason why is pretty simple. When you're diagnosing problems, no one really cares about the surface level problem. In order to get to something that's actually that's actually actionable. Wow, that's a hard word to say. You need to keep asking why and digging deeper and deeper until you get to the root causes of something that you can actually solve. No one's expecting you to have all the answers or to be an expert in something, but you do need to care enough to kind of keep digging, keep asking why. And you're not trying to be, annoying to people. You just want to understand what the story is. A lot of this job is chasing down that story and then building another story around how you can fix it. And finally, kind of putting all that together. If you like solving problems, you like variety, you like being curious, at the end of the day, if you like optimizing and figuring stuff out and how things could be better, even if you're not necessarily the one who's like the face of a project, this could be a really good job for you. If you're the type of person who likes finding smarter ways to do something, you might really like this job, because you'd be surprised at the amount of inefficiency and just stuff that doesn't work well, even at really well-established organizations that you think have their shit together. Like working at one of the biggest tech companies in the world, I thought, wow, everything's gonna run super smoothly. No, a lot of stuff is still duct taped together, a lot of stuff is ad hoc, and as a BizOps person, you get the opportunity to figure out how to make things better, how to make things work faster or smarter, the Kanye West song now. But yeah, like if that excites you, this could be a really good job for you. Okay, let's minimize all the good things. Let's talk a little bit about some of the bad things. Or maybe not even bad things, but like why this job might not be a good fit for you. One, if you're someone who needs stability to do your best work, BizOps might not be a great place for you. And you already might get a sense of why. Like if you thrive in structured environments where you have really clear goals, you have a lot of deep, uninterrupted focus time, BizOps is probably gonna feel super chaotic. For me, there were weeks where everything was a fire drill. You'd be building like a pricing or financial model in the morning, writing slides for a completely different deck the next morning. And then it always feels like you're playing catch up. Like priorities, goals are always changing. And it feels like you just built something a week ago and now you're being asked to change it because someone changed their mind about what it should look like. It's frustrating at times. If you're someone who wants to know what your workload is looking like on a given week, on a given day, the unpredictability of the work in BizOps might drive you crazy. Very exciting for some people, very frustrating and chaotic. Something else that's also very commonplace in BizOps is this idea of seeing things through. You might not like BizOps if you actually like to see projects through end to end. What I mean by that is in BizOps, oftentimes you don't own the final decision or the implementation for something. You build the analysis, you tell the story, have the deck, and then you just kind of hand it off. Sometimes you're also responsible for the execution and implementation of it, like I talked about earlier. But most of the time, you're not the person who's actually seeing the project through at the end and making sure that things are actually done. If you get energy from making sure that the stuff that you've been working on actually gets done, this job can start to feel pretty empty because a lot of the work is gonna live in slide decks, emails, newsletters, and these kind of big strategy reviews, but you're not always around to see if anything actually happens. And so you're not sure if you've actually made an impact or if you've just made a pretty deck that sounded good. And this ties in directly to the third point of this job might not be a good fit if you care more about impact than praise. There's a really big difference between doing work that looks good and doing work that makes a difference. And for me, honestly, this was one of the biggest challenges because I realized that a lot of the work that I was doing, I couldn't actually track whether or not the analyses that I did made any difference because the signals of good work weren't some number going up, wasn't a clear metric and something you can measure. Good work was whether or not people said good work, like whether or not they looked at your presentation and said, that was a really good slide, or whether they kept asking you to help solve their problems. And this is the same thing at my level. This is the same thing like level up, 2 levels up, 3 levels up. It was always by proxy, just someone telling you that it was good work or someone going back to you. The more that people trusted you, the better you were at your job and the more impact that you were having. I found that really unsatisfying because I come from like a research background in undergrad at least, where oftentimes you're trying to run experiments. You're trying to find causality. In an enterprise sales organization, which is what I was a part of, you can't do that. There is no causality. And that wore me down. Like for some people, it doesn't matter. They just enjoy doing the work and they can see the impact that they're having through the people and the interactions. But for me, I wanted to see like a number go up. I wanted to be able to tie something that I was doing to something concrete. Something else that also wore me down over the years was intellectual rigor or intellectual honesty. So the bullet I have there is like, you care about intellectual honesty. This might not be a good fit for you. It's a little bit loaded, but let me explain what that means. When we did analyses, we really did try our best to be rigorous. Like we spent time in the data, often a lot of time with the data to figure out like what is the evidence showing. But when you're in a fast-moving organization, executives don't have time for that detail or that nuance. Business decisions are happening quick. They just want a recommendation that they can feel good about, and so they can carry on and go into their 50 other meetings. Oftentimes that means that you're writing a proposal and pitching something that you actually don't feel that good about because you'd have a meeting tomorrow or at the end of the week and the story had to land. So even if your data was messy, you had to have a clean narrative. So you could be working on something for like 2 months, and then the final version of that you see doesn't click with what you've actually been working on. It sounds maybe a little too confident, sounds a little too good to be true. And that for me always felt a little bit like bullshit. Like, I totally understand why that is. Like, yeah, if you're, someone in the C-suite, you don't have time to understand the methodology, the little details. You just want to know, like, this is a good path forward. I get that. Being on the other side of that though, especially coming from like an academic research background where everything was super rigorous, you're trying to find statistical significance, p-values that make sense. This felt weird. It felt just like not honest to me. But that's honestly how a lot of the business world works. You don't have time for nice statistical tests and rigor, or even a regression. Like, most people didn't know what a regression is, or if they saw one, they thought that you were really smart. So that's something to be mindful of if you're entering this environment. It's really fast paced. Things are happening quickly. You might not have time to get the answer that you're actually looking for, but you still have to sound good about it. Fake it till you make it. Like, that's the name of the game here. And then finally, BizOps might not be a good fit for you if you don't like managing emotions, egos, and people. Basically, if you don't like playing politics. Because the hardest part, at the end of the day, wasn't the data, or wasn't about putting a slide together, it was the people. Convincing teams to align when they have different goals and different agendas is a really, really difficult thing to do. And your mileage may vary. The larger the organization, the more difficult this might be. And the hard part isn't that like people are backstabbing you or sabotaging you. That's often not the case. That'd actually be easier to understand if people were evil and bad. The hardest part is like people are genuinely trying to do a good job of what they're doing. It's just that what they're doing doesn't necessarily match up with what you care about. And so the question becomes, how do you get people to care about your point of view, your perspective, and do what you want them to do? But you're not their boss, you don't have power over them. And this is where you're trying to navigate that whole playing field. You're trying to get people to like you, you're trying to build trust, relationships. You can't always take what people say at face value. You have to understand the relationships that different people have. And this means that when you're talking strategy, you're not just talking about being strategic, you're talking about being diplomatic. And that's a whole different ballgame. Like, coming from a consulting research background, I knew how to do data analysis, run numbers, all that good quantitative stuff. What I did not have as much experience of, and what I to this day still find very draining, is navigating all the kind of, for lack of a better word, bullshit and politics around it. If you're working on something that you really care about, this is an obstacle, sure, but it's a necessary one, and I get that. Like, if you really care and are passionate about a goal or a project or something that you think will have really high impact, this is just part of the job. That's totally fine, and I get that. But, going back to something I said earlier, impact oftentimes isn't really clear. The proposals that you're making aren't necessarily baked in evidence. It's just something that you kind of feel good enough or directional about. And so if we take this idea of impact being kind of questionable or unclear, and then navigating a lot of politics to make sure it gets done, it's like, why do we have so much conviction about this idea and have to get through all this political stuff if we're not that confident about what the impact of this change is going to be? Those two things combined together were pretty draining. You don't know if what you're doing is actually going to make a difference. But at the same time, you're spending weeks, months trying to get people on board with your idea. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance that comes from that. At the end of the day, how does this all fit together? Well, this is where we come to the very end, where I'm going to throw this back to you and ask you to be a little bit reflective, to think about some of these questions and what good work actually looks like. I want to encourage you to not just fall for the prestige, the pay, like those are great things, but on a day-to-day basis, it doesn't matter how big your paycheck is if you're feeling tired and drained by the work and it feels like you're just trying to survive Monday through Friday so you can get to the weekend. That's so much of your time. That's 5 out of 7 days. And if you're exhausted by working, that kind of bleeds into the other parts of your life. Just because you're working 9 to 5 doesn't mean your brain is just thinking about the 9 to 5. It can be something that bleeds into the rest of your life, even when you're offline, so that you're never really off. You're never really recharged, and you're kind of in this state of fatigue all the time. So this section is for you to think about whether or not the trade-offs that I've talked about are worth it. Because for me, I spent a lot of years doing this work. I built models, I solved messy problems, built decks, helped people make decisions, and it did teach me a lot. Specifically, it taught me how to think faster, break down complex problems, give it some structure, and then execute to get shit done. Like, that's a skill set that I'm gonna take with me wherever I go, because spoiler alert, I don't work in this job anymore. But I learned a lot from it. There's a lot that I'm grateful for. But at the same time, maybe the most important lesson that it taught me after chasing this career path of the past 5 years is that it's really important to find work that's good for you, not just work that you're good at. Because I realized that the more that I worked at this job, the better I got at it, the less I actually liked it, which is a signal for me that, hey, maybe I'm not on the right path. And that becomes really clear when you look at the people above you, you look at leadership, and you ask yourself, is that what I want to be doing in 5 years or 10 years from now? And for me, the answer was no. It's like the stuff that I enjoy doing, the more that you advance in the organization, the less of that you did, and the more politics and people that you had to work with. And I don't mean that in like, I hate people. Like, no, I really love working with people and collaborating. But if you're collaborating on things that you don't really care about, then that can be really draining for you. If you want to navigate the politics and you find that enjoyable, great. That is your career path. Good for you. Go for it. For me, I realized this is probably not something that I care that much about. And it might be specific to working in a big organization. It might have been specific to the organization that I was in. And so I am curious, like, what BizOps and strategy looks like if you're at a much smaller organization. Like, you have 20 people, there's probably not as many politics. You don't have time for bullshit because you have to execute on things that are truly urgent or the business is going to collapse. I don't know. I've talked to friends who have worked at startups, and it's kind of the sense that I get. All right. Enough about myself though. If you're considering BizOps, these are a few good questions to ask yourself. One is, what kind of pressure brings out the best in you and what kind wears you down? Because as we've talked about today, there's a lot of high stakes and a lot of high pressure when you're working with executives and important problems. Is that something that you find energizing? That kind of leads into the second question. Like, when the stakes are high and everybody's watching, do you feel energized? Or is that something that makes you feel like you're walking on a tightrope? You're on edge, you're nervous, you get tired. And don't think about that just in terms of, can I do this 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 month at a time even? Think about this on a year-to-year basis. Like, is this the kind of career that you want where there's constant pressure and that pressure is pushing you to do your best? Or do you think that's something that's gonna leave you feeling exhausted, anxious, tired? For different people, this brings up entirely different answers. It's important to understand what this means for you. The next question is really, how do you want feedback to show up? What does impact look like for you? Is it numbers, concrete outcomes? Is it something different like recognition and praise? If you really like concrete, tangible ROI, but you don't get that, depending on the role that you're in, BizOps can be really tiring because you don't get a 5% increase, 10% increase in something. You get, hey, that was really good work, thanks. And for some people, that's enough. For me, that wasn't. And finally, at the end of the day, if you distill everything together, this is perhaps the most important question. What does a good workday actually feel like for you? At the end of the day, when you look back, what do you want to say you've accomplished? Is it, man, I sat down for 3 or 4 hours and I was really focused. I got to think really deeply about something. Is it, wow, I get to talk to a lot of different people. I got to work on this project and kind of really push it forward. Is it, I don't even want to work, which is honestly an answer for a lot of people too, and that's totally fine. But 99.99% of us need a job. So what does a good workday on the job feel like for you? What do you feel like at the end of the day? Are you exhausted? Are you still energized? Think about that. Let it sit for a little bit. For me, something that I've realized is a good workday feels like a lot of focused work. It feels like a lot of time to think. It feels like working on things and collaborating on things where I feel like everyone cares and we're all kind of on the same page. That sometimes looks like a business context. Sometimes it doesn't, and it might be more creative. Right now, I'm pursuing a path where I have a little bit more flexibility in my schedule to choose what I want to work on. Because what I found is, after working for BizOps in 3 years, at the end of each workday, I'd feel really tired. It felt like I was always tilting between one of these two extremes, where I was really isolated or I was really extroverted. It didn't really ever strike the balance that I wanted to, and part of that was the unpredictability of the job and just things changing constantly. Like, if I spent the entire day working on a model, super introverted, I just feel very cooped up and want to talk to people and be super extroverted at the end of the day. Then sometimes I'd have the reverse. I'd spend the whole day talking to people on back-to-back meetings, and I'd just be drained and want to hermit up somewhere underneath a blanket by the end of the day. I've realized that though I like novelty, I probably need a bit more stability in the work that I want to do. Maybe that's contradictory to me just saying it'd be interesting to work in a startup, but I think the through line of that is, like, I'd probably really want to care about the work that I'm doing. And when you really care about something, it's just fun. Like, you are energized and you work through the whole day without even feeling like you've worked on the whole day. Sometimes that's what YouTube is like. It's pretty good. All right, if you've made it to the end of the video, congratulations to you. You just listened to a 30-minute video about BizOps. But really, if you think about it, 30 minutes isn't really all that long for something as important as a huge career decision. If we were grabbing a coffee in real life, this is the conversation that we'd have. I'd be real with you, I'd be honest. I'm not gonna be super idealistic about the job because I've done it. But at the same time, I'm not gonna be super cynical and tell you, like, this is an awful thing, don't do it, because that's not true. I got a lot out of it, but it also took a lot from me. I hope that that's what you got by the end of the video. You have a clear understanding of what you might be walking into. And obviously, I'm just one person, right? This is just one perspective. Keep doing your homework. Keep looking into whether or not this is something that's right for you. In the meantime, if you found this video useful, let me know. I spent a lot of time scripting, researching, and working on these videos. And then I'm probably gonna spend a lot of time editing this afterwards. So if you found this useful, please do let me know. You can drop a comment below about what you found useful or other questions that you have. You can like, you can subscribe. You can even buy me a coffee if you want to. I'll drop one of those links, I don't know. In the meantime, if you're curious about how I even made the transition to BizOps and working in tech, I made a video about that. I'll link that here, and you can see how I went from consulting and that grind to working in tech. See you next time for the next coffee chat.